Well, I was allocated 45 minutes, which means that we end at 12:15. And I try to take no more than up to 30 minutes in order to leave some time to the discussion. What I wanted to show you, we'll discuss, I think it's the most important topic in social sciences. And this is about the relationship between institutional systems and quality of life. Both variables are multidimensional. They have some dimensions describing institutional systems and some dimensions describing the quality of life. And there's a massive research about the links underappreciated. Shall I start from scratch? No. Okay, what are the main dimensions describing institutional systems and the country level? I will list them and then very briefly discuss. First, the mode of succession of those people who govern. One of them is democracy. Second, civil liberties. Third, rule of law. Fourth, economic freedom. Fifth, fiscal stance. These are variables. These are not constants. And we now, since 50 years' time, have some measures of institutions. Democracy is best defined, as Schumpeter did, as open regular competition, which requires political parties in a massive societies, and requires civil liberties. Otherwise, you cannot compete. So there is a link between what we call democracy and the extent of civil rights, freedom of association, freedom of speech, freedom of movement, etc., etc. So then, the rule of law, 1,000 definitions, but the intuition is usually right. It is a situation where those who govern in the state act through law which respects human rights. The basic human rights, and the basic human rights is the due process, which includes, of course, the independence of the judges. And you can't have a high level of the rule of law if one party or one group lastingly captures the state. Then you can't have democracy either. Why? Because in this situation, the rulers can arrest the competitors, like Putin has done with Navalny in Russia, or Maduro has done with his competitor who was deprived of citizen rights. So, there is a triad. What we consider to be democracy in the Western sense is regular competition through elections, civil rights which make it possible to compete, and rule of law which is indispensable for the competition. If these conditions are not met, we have a mock democracy, like in Putin, like it was under communism, etc. Besides, there are two other dimensions. Economic freedom, a large extent of economic freedom is extremely important, but very much underappreciated, especially by many so-called humanists. Why it is so important? Because we know when we lose it, what are the costs? But let me say what does it mean that it's a large extent of economic freedom. You mean there are full property rights and free markets not hampered by excessive regulations. Thank you very much. Okay. And that these property rights are well and reasonably equally protected. So economic freedom for all, and not only for the choosing. And the fiscal stance I am going to show you, sorry, is it visible or not? Okay. Now all of these variables can be illustrated by indices. So on the right you see countries which have a very low level of political rights which overlap with democracy. On the left you have countries which have high including until now at least Poland. The same goes, these are just illustrations, so you can measure it imperfectly, but still, better than nothing. Rule of law, huge differentiation, and as one could expect, these dimensions overlap, meaning that countries which rank very low on civil rights usually rank very low on the rule of law. Economic freedom, sharp differentiation, but you should remember that available measures disregard taxes. It means that according to these measures, it does not matter whether taxes are equal 10% of GDP or 90%, which is a snag. So one should, it is not easy to include taxes in the measures of economic freedom, but one should do it. One should estimate the sort of voluntary taxes, which probably would no more than 10% of GDP, and all above would reduce the measured economic freedom. Now, this is very interesting. You know, so-called Wagner law, which says that the richer the country, the higher spending to GDP, especially the social spend. This is a nonsense. It has been the nonsense, but nonsenses have very great power of attracting other people, people who repeat these nonsenses. On the horizontal axis, you have per capita income. On the vertical axis, you have the ratio of social spending to GDP. Oh God. On the right axis, on the horizontal, this axis, vertical, you have social spending to GDP, and you have huge variation, which means there is no correlation. And you have, this variation exists at every level of per capita income, meaning you have poor countries where social spending to GDP ranges, as in Ukraine, from 35% to 5%, no correlation. The same goes for medium and rich. By the way, there is a cliche that United States, there is no welfare state and people are dying on the street. That's it. No, that's of course true. United States have a ratio of social spending to GDP which is higher than Switzerland and higher than Canada. But this is a very badly structured welfare state. Now, based on these differentiations, you can build many typologies. And this is just one. Now, I start with what was socialism. For some people, socialism is a sacred word, so it cannot denote anything bad. So they say, no, this was not socialism. Socialism was in Sweden. So then they prefer the word communism. But the root is the same, social, community. So what was introduced as socialism was true to the original definition, which is this: elimination of economic freedom. Banning private ownership, replacing it by monopoly of state ownership, abolishing market by replacing it by central planning. And once you do this, you have to abolish all other rights. So the notion of democratic socialism is like vegetarian hyena. It's equally sensible. You have. So what's the most important institution under any socialism? Secret police, KGB. Otherwise, this system could not be maintained. The second category is quasi-socialism. Many people are surprised or not surprised that most of Islamic countries are economically very badly. And some of them try to make a link between Islam and economic performance, which I think is dubious. What do they overlook? They overlook that most of these countries are quasi-socialist. The state dominates, and you have the same problems. There was a notion of Arab socialism. So meaning that the majority of the economy is dominated by the politicians, and that's it. South Arabia is socialist. Why? Because oil, which is the bulk of the economy, is nationalized, it's national property. Iran is quasi-socialist. Only They are not called general secretaries, they are called ayatollahs. But do not be blinded by words. Okay. Now the third, the word capitalist was invented by the enemies of capitalism. This is why it sounds very badly. Capitalists cannot denote anything good. And there's a lot of nonsense in the discussion about capitalism because people usually, these enemies usually attack the bad kinds of capitalism and ascribe these deficiencies to the best kind of capitalism. This is done on purpose or out of stupidity. Now, what is the best kind? Empirically speaking. I am not preaching any doctrine. You can check. The best kind can be called entrepreneurial capitalism or free market, which does not mean anarchy. It requires rule of law in a Hayekian sense, general rules. But what is typical for this system? High and reasonably equal protection of extensive property rights. Reasonably equal. So you have freedom of entry, you have exit, etc., etc. It is very difficult nowadays to find something which is a very good illustration. But I would say the closest countries which come to this, Ireland, Hong Kong, at least until recently, Switzerland, except for services, trade. So you have some approximation. What is that kind of capitalism? Chronic capitalism. It should not be confused with a free market, because under chronic capitalism, you have a sharply unequal division of economic freedom. You have minorities, which are usually called oligarchs. They're either politicians or politicians' cousins or colleagues, and they enjoy all kinds of privileges, including the privilege to rob other entrepreneurs by using state apparatus. So it is easy to see it's a very bad regime, unjust, unfair, and inefficient, because you can't have much competition between these two parts of entrepreneurs. And it exists in Russia, to some extent in Ukraine, even though I think it's being reduced, different sort. So when some people in Poland speak about the oligarchs, they don't know what they say. Because oligarchs, by definition, are those people who gain wealth through political connections and not through innovations. Steve Jobs was not an oligarch, according to this definition. And then there is a mixed bag of capitalistic countries which are first overregulated, and some of them are overtaxed and fiscally fragile. And this is most of these OECD. Why? Because of persistently bad policies. So anti-liberal policies, the consequences are usually blamed on free markets. So whenever G20 meets, I'm always worried, whom are they going to blame? They never blame themselves. They have to blame the markets, including central bankers who like to blame the markets. One digression. One of the greatest fallacies is to believe in mainstream story that crises are due to capitalism. It's very, very widespread. It's like saying that sneezing is caused by the nose. You have sneezing in the nose, but is the nose the reason for the sneezing? So they confuse correlation with causation. But not only that. First, if you look around the world, you see that the deepest crises have occurred under non-market dictatorships, like Mao Zedong, economic and human catastrophe, 70 million people dead, Stalin, Khmer Rouge, Cuba, etc. So the deepest crises in the market economies are very shallow compared to these tragedies. But second, if you look empirically, you see that at the bottom of the crisis, you have various combinations of bad policies, usually encouraging people to borrow too much. And government do not need to be encouraged to borrow too much. So how can one blame fiscal crisis on the markets, where borrowing is done by the politicians? But even financial crises, which manifest themselves in the boom and then the bust, are driven by bad policies, and this has been shown empirically by people like Kalomiris and some other, Dodd and some other. There are many empirical researchers. But this is the story of anti-capitalism. Capitalism is to be blamed for the crisis. So you have these and other typologies, and you can try to have, based on existing research, to describe the links between various systems and various dimensions of economic and other performance. But before that, let me see that you can also describe the transitions, including transitions into good and bad. So we have experienced a very good transition in Poland and most Central Europe, moving from the worst possible system, which was called socialism, to something which resembled the free market capitalism, which includes rule of law, etc., etc. Since a certain time, in some countries, we have beginnings of bad transition after free elections. Hungary, not to mention Turkey, in Poland, it is on the one response, organized and blocked, without looking at other countries for help. This is something, this is a test for Polish society. Once you win it, you will be stronger. Really strong. So you can use this typology for describing various transitions, but let me come to the second point, which is empirical links. And now I will just very briefly mention what we know from empirical research, massive empirical research. First let me see what are the dimensions of quality of life. Certainly, economic growth determines the level of consumption. Second, which sometimes to some extent is linked, employment versus non-employment, unemployment. Third, health. Fourth, self-realization. Sounds very sociological, but it can be defined. Fifth, extent of fear. So you have economic and non-economic dimensions, and they can be linked to the differences in economic system and to the changes in institutional system. Now, there are some other factors, but they do matter much less. Meaning, climate is not the main determinant. Climate should not be blamed. Of course, location only in small cases. You can't prosper if you're located exclusively in Sahara. But most of countries are not located in Sahara Desert. Natural resources are not a blessing for countries with weak institutions. They are a grave risk. So what is left as a most important determinant? Institutional systems. People sound very proud, but people put into a bad system would perform very badly. Institutional systems. And you have illustration. South and North Korea, the same culture. And huge differences. Each arose during 50 years' time. Unbelievable. East and West Germany, etc., etc. This is why it is by far the most important social problem. What institutional system do you have? In what direction are you heading? Okay, now, very briefly. Economic growth, the pace of economic growth is extremely important for well-being, especially poor countries. And I think we know what are the main determinants. First, economic freedom. You cannot have growth by top-down policies. You can only have white elephants. Why? Because politicians do not have detailed knowledge and have perverse incentives. They are not punished for failures, but are rather rewarded for failures by spectacular investment. And they do not participate in the benefits, because this is called corruption. So they are absolutely incapable to be good investors. You may find 1 and 2 examples, but they prove nothing. So if you hear about industrial policy, or top-down, or national, what is called capitalism, this is old old ideas. So economic freedom, meaning full property rights were equally protected. This creates market competition. There is no substitute for market competition as far as the driver of innovation is concerned. And what is related to free market, rule of law. You need protection from independent justice system. Now, these are illustrations. Employment. There's a massive research about the reasons for the differences in employment, non-employment, and unemployment, especially OECD. We don't know. I think there are no puzzles. There are only problems to be solved. Now, first, there's obviously a strong correlation between the rate of economic growth and job creation. But second, you may have educational mismatches. So some people can't find jobs. I am always puzzled why so many people study political science in Poland. Do they all dream to be deputies? Or to be in the Ministry of Justice? Like one day deputy minister? So you have to be really responsible for your future. And on the other hand, there are vacancies. So, and educational system is largely the monopoly of the state. So the failure of educational system is a failure of the state. And one should draw conclusions from that. And finally, there are some welfare states which create social traps, meaning that it does not pay to move from unemployment to employment or from low-paid job to higher productive job. And there are many of these social traps. This is inhuman. Certainly it's not, it's antisocial. Okay, there are certain important indices of health. Most people prefer to live longer lives than shorter lives, I think. So if life expectancy grows, it's good. And if less infants die, it's also good. And this is linked, empirical, one can show, to economic growth, which in turn is linked to economic regime. And also the transition can bring about, pro-capitalistic transition can bring some health effects. This is not very well researched, but it's true. First, on the example in Poland. If you introduce free market reforms, you introduce a revolution in prices. And because of this revolution, prices of more healthy food became more available and lower. So millions of people without any government propaganda switched to healthy diet, more healthy diet. And they switched, some of them at least, from vodka to wine, which is pretty good for your health. In those societies where the male population did not switch, the male population is not enjoying high life expectancy like in Russia. And finally, under socialists, there was an unwritten social right. You could drink on the job. Now, under capitalism, you are not allowed because capitalists, as you know, are very cruel people. So people cannot drink on the job, and there are less accidents. So profit motive, which is a devil's invention, can be good for the health of the people. Now, health. Okay. Now, I can only mention there's a sea of nonsense regarding the discussion about inequality. Unbelievable nonsense. And the fact that the most fashionable economist, which is called Thomas Piketty, is called the new Marx, and this is being regarded as a compliment, shows what sort of Marxist deviation there exists in the West. Because he has proven nothing. He has just shown the time series, but has drawn the wrong conclusions from the time series. And it was unmasked. But it doesn't matter. His story was the rich are the culprits. Second, any basic discussion about inequality should start with a distinction between inequality of income and inequality of opportunity. Then you can follow. I can come to that in the... And finally, there is a link between types intensity of inequalities and the systems. Under chronic capitalism, you have much higher inequality of opportunity and of income than under free market capitalism. Because under free market capitalism, you have more competition. Under socialism, people say there is no inequality. But this is a lie, because there's extremely high inequality in power. Extremely. And those who have power are two kinds. The worst kind, fanatics of power, who are ascetics. Ascetic dictator is very dangerous. Because he likes only power, cheap power. Stalin was not a bon vivant, very much. And then those who enjoy easy life. And, you know, in the absolute dictatorship, your country is yours. You don't need private property rights. It is yours. If you don't think about your children, it's yours. So, socialism or communism, extreme inequality. Last 2 points. Self-realization. In every society, there are some people who like to be private entrepreneurs, independent artists, journalists, writers, but they can do it only under some systems. They cannot do it under dictatorships, especially socialist dictatorships, because this is banned, which means human drama and the waste of human capital. And some of these people emigrated if they could. So one should look at the opportunities which are created by various systems. And the last point is fear. The worst system are not the systems which are economically worse, are also worse along this dimension. So there is no trade-off. Systems which suppress all freedoms, which necessitates a very strong position of KGB, also produce fear, without which they could not be maintained. So there is no win-win, or there is no trade-off. There is lose-lose. And you can only abandon such a system. It's extremely important, an extreme improvement. But once you move, it's not enough to make this step. You have to defend better institutions in almost every country. Because good things, including good institutions, do not fall like manna from heaven. And you can live very well in terms of power, in terms of money, but by undermining the good system. So ultimately, a good system which was introduced will be maintained depending on how many people in well-organized forms stop complaining, but in well-organized forms start acting more and more and more. Bad rulers do not have internal inhibitions. They have to be stopped by external powers, which have to be created by civil society. Thank you very much. So I understand that 15 minutes, because we started 15 minutes late. Yes. Who would coordinate? I will coordinate. I will ask you for short questions or short disagreements. Yes.
On the Tradeoff Civil Development Forum, I have two short questions. One.
Allocation. Non-market allocation.
Okay, so I think about the idea of the referendum in Poland. It is an idea of President Andrzej Duda on constitutional referendum, and I think it can be we made the free market, pro-free market people can look at it with some distrust, but I think it can be regarded also as some chance to the for the revival of the civic society, for the like more free market ideas can be promoted during this constitutional debate. So I think it's not.
Sorry, it depends on the question. So it's no point in discussing referendums in general, but the question and the timing. The answers depend on the questions. So you can have a referendum. What is worse, liberalism or neoliberalism? What answer would you expect? Okay, next question. Yes.
Please raise the hands up.
Kamil Grabarczyk, University of Zielona Góra. There is a huge possibility that the Five-Star Movement will win the coming legislative elections in Italy. Even if they won't gain a majority alone, they can create a coalition with the even more populistic and more anti-European, anti-Eurozone and pro-Russian Liga North party. So in this context, what do you think, how do you see the future of Europe, of the European Union, and the future of the Eurozone? Thank you.
Okay, I am not engaging in prophecies, first. Second, there is a huge misconception that whatever problems exist in the European Union area, they are due to European institutions. No, the worst problems are created by some national governments. What about French problems? So, and the French problems can be only solved by the French authorities. The same goes for Italy. I am saying it because it's very popular. Partly it is based on logical inconception that people, whatever happens in Europe is to be blamed on Europe. But then people think are European institutions, which is a nonsense. I'm not saying they are completely innocent, but my reading tells me that the worst regulations are of national production, including British, I think, at least some of them, zoning, and certainly that's it's true of Poland. But populist politicians like to blame the European Union. On Euro, of course, there was an original sin committed by admitting Greece and perhaps Italy. And this was purely political. These are fact accompli. Perhaps it would have been better to let Greece go, but this step was not taken. So once Greece is in, it has to reform, because I think Greece's cumulative decline of 25% is due to delaying the most important structural reforms and balancing the budget through worst way by increasing tax rates while preserving many tax preferences. So in this way, you can only suffer. Okay? Well, there are three types of reforms if you start from a socialist economy close by. First, stabilization. If you inherit high inflation, you have to stabilize the economy, and you have to cut the budget deficit, which is financed by printing money. That's it. It's very simple intellectually, sometimes difficult politically, but there is no puzzle. Second, liberalization. Removing constraints, administrative, legal constraints of economic freedom, external liberalization, internal liberalization, plus liberalization, convertibility of money. Then you create free market, or much more free market. And then something which requires a little more time, which are creating new organization or restructuring organizations, like central bank, prosecutors' courts, and enterprises. But with enterprises, there's very simple and powerful and only effective solution, privatizing. So delay in privatization is delay in eradicating socialism. Because socialism meant state ownership. Now, and experience shows that there are massive research, comparative research, there are countries which did it quickly and massively, like Poland and the Baltics later, achieved much quicker improvement, which was maintained, and then you can compare per capita income in Poland with that of Belarus or Ukraine. And it is, regarding Ukraine, it is 2.5 to 3 times higher. This is the price of not introducing massive and early reforms. You can compare. There's a lot of international research. Of course, not all the people make these comparisons. And in every country you have populists who are trying to say these policies have created poverty, even though it is absolutely false. So you have, besides having good policy, you have to fight populists. Always. It's a very pleasant occupation. But not through boring lectures. No. You have to be sharp. First of all, you have to unmask populist language. If you adopt the populist language, you are lost. So remember, first, there are two kinds of words or expressions. First is a hate speech against freedom, especially economic freedom. Meaning, shock therapy, for example, or liberalism, neoliberalism, or austerity. So instead of saying fiscal consolidation, they say austerity, which is by definition very bad, including IMF. And then you have nice words. Bad words serve to demonize good policies. Nice words serve to make bad policies attractive. What are the most dangerous nice words? Social. Everything which is called social is good, isn't it? This is why we have social market economy. Common, of course, is not selfish. It's good. National. You know. So, first step, unmask the language. Never use populist language. If you agree in this, for the discussion in the language of populists, you are lost. Because these words are playing upon emotions, and I think the impact of these words is pretty similar to the impact of white narcotics, drugs. I must see for the research, but probably it's true. Okay?
Yes, so thank you, Stefan Sandeski from the Austrian Embassy. So my question is, what was the difference in your view between the transition process in Russia in the 1990s and the transition process in Poland? Why did it fail in Russia, supposedly, and why was it successful in Poland? Thank you.
There is a very good book written by a friend of mine, Yegor Gaidar, who unfortunately died. There is, I think, unjust criticism regarding Russian reformers. This stupid expression, shock without therapy. I think it's very unjust, but popular. First, they started under, I think, more difficult conditions. And certain problems were created under Gorbachev. Oligarchs have emerged under Gorbachev. Why? Because Gorbachev he introduced liberalization of de facto private property, which was called cooperatives, in a situation of huge state sector and central planning, rigid prices. So you could easily get rich. Being a director of state company, you create a subsidiary or private one company, and you bought cheaply from your company and you sell expensively. So certain problems, we did not have such problems in Poland. Secondly, there was much more difficult political situation, I think. So I think in Poland we have more or less 2 years of relative political calm. But this was not given to the Russian reformers. Despite that, they did extremely courageous reforms. And then they were replaced by non-reformers, but the blame was put on reformers. So if you carefully study, they made some errors, but compared to the situation and compared to what they did, they deserve a great respect. One should not go for a very cheap criticism. Now, they face certain dramatic solutions, dramatic dilemmas, which were not faced in Poland. For example, elections of Yeltsin. And there was perceived, and I think true, a danger that communists could win and reverse everything. And then they have to choose either to let this risk materialize or accept money from the oligarchs to support Yeltsin. What would you choose? I think it's very easy to criticize when you do not know the choice situation. This is a very cheap criticism, very, very prevalent in the West. You know, normally speaking, ignorance helps you to be critical. Okay. I am not forcing anybody to ask questions. I am only saying that we have 2, 3, 4 minutes.
If you please, one more last question. I would like you very kindly to comment, to present your point about immigration, what is being, let's say, imposed on Poland. How do you see this subject, sir? Thank you very much.
There are two situations of poor countries. First, countries closed. People cannot emigrate. This was a situation of all socialist economists. They could illegally try to emigrate. The second, a poor country opens. So socialism is gone. Then in every country you have some people who emigrate to richer countries. Incentives matter. 40 years ago, many Spaniards of 50 years emigrated to France. Now, if you are, so you have two solutions. You close your country, which is fortunately impossible, or you introduce reforms and policies which let your country grow faster than poor countries. And then with the passage of time, less and less people would emigrate. This happened with Spain, and recently, this is the lesson. So those who block reforms and slow down economic growth, they would stimulate immigration from Poland. These are so-called patriots. So bad policies which slows down economic growth encourages emigration from Poland of young people.
Time for one more question, so if we still have someone here. Very short.
So my question is now about the free market narration in Poland. Do you think that it is the free market arguments in Poland are maybe too much focused only on entrepreneurs, and ideas like small taxes for ordinary employees are forgotten? Thank you.
Frankly speaking, I don't know whose ideas are we speaking about and whether you are not confusing ideas with propaganda. So I cannot respond, but we can discuss it during the break. Okay? Do not confuse ideas with propaganda. Do not confuse slogans with propaganda and ideas. You have to beat propaganda, you have to be better in communication. That's it. Thank you very much.